You've spent your whole life being told you were smart, and somewhere along the way, you started to believe that meant something, that it would protect you, that eventually it would all come together. But it hasn't, not the way you imagined. And the hardest part? You can see exactly why other people fail. You understand the patterns, you've read the books, you know what needs to be done, and you still don't do it. That's not a motivation problem. It's not laziness. And it's definitely not a lack of intelligence. What's happening to you is something much quieter, much harder to name, and almost nobody is talking about it honestly. Because here's what I've come to understand after years of watching brilliant people stay stuck. Intelligence doesn't protect you from self-destruction. Sometimes it makes it worse. This video is about that. About the specific, invisible ways that smart people waste the one thing they were always told was their greatest asset. Stay with me. There's a version of you that you've been carrying around for a long time. Not the version people see. Not the one that shows up to work, answers emails, handles what needs to be handled. I'm talking about the version that lives in the back of your mind. The one that knows what you're capable of. The one that's been waiting. You've felt it. In quiet moments, usually late at night, when the noise dies down and it's just you and your thoughts. There's this sense of something unfinished, something larger than your current life, a version of yourself you haven't become yet, but somehow know exists. And the strange thing is, that feeling doesn't go away with age. If anything, it gets louder, more urgent. Because at 40, at 45, at 50, you're no longer dealing with abstract potential. You're dealing with time, and time has a way of making everything feel more real. But here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. That gap you feel between who you are and who you know you could be, it's not evidence of failure. It's not proof that you missed your window. That gap is information, and most people never learn to read it correctly. They either ignore it, numb it, stay busy enough that they don't have to look at it directly, or they turn it into a weapon they use against themselves. A constant reminder of everything they haven't done. Neither of those is the answer. Because that feeling, that persistent sense of unlived potential, it didn't come from nowhere. It came from something real inside you, something that hasn't died. No matter how many times you've started over, fallen short, or convinced yourself it was too late. And in order to understand why you've been stuck, we have to start at the beginning. Not your beginning, the beginning of a pattern, one that was built into you long before you had any say in the matter. Most people think intelligence is a gift, and in many ways it is. But gifts come with costs that nobody puts on the label. When you're the smart one growing up, you learn something fast. You learn that potential is currency. People invest in you because of what they believe you'll become. Teachers, parents, coaches, they all see something in you. And that attention feels good. It feels like love sometimes, like belonging. But it comes attached to a condition. Stay promising. Keep showing that you could be something great. Don't disappoint us. And so you learn at a very young age to live in the future, to be valuable, not for what you are right now, but for what you might become. Your worth becomes tied to potential rather than presence, to what's possible rather than what's real. That's where it starts. That's the first crack in the foundation. But here's what makes it complicated. That pattern doesn't feel like a trap when you're inside it. It feels like ambition. It feels like drive. You're always reaching for the next thing, always telling yourself that once you figure it out, once the timing is right, once you feel ready, then you'll finally move. And the years pass, not all at once. Slowly, one reasonable delay at a time, one almost started project at a time, one more thing to figure out before you commit. And at some point, you look up and realize that the future you've been living in your head for decades is still just that, a future, unchanged, waiting. The cruelest thing about this pattern is that it disguises itself as wisdom, thinking before acting, considering all angles, not rushing into things. These sound like virtues. and sometimes they are. But there's a version of that same behavior that is just fear wearing a rational mask. And smart people are especially good at building that mask because they have the vocabulary for it. They can construct an airtight argument for why now isn't the right time, why the plan needs more refinement, why the risk is too high. Intelligence, when it's driven by fear, becomes the most sophisticated procrastination tool ever invented. And that's what nobody told you when they were praising how smart you were. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that smart people carry. It's not physical. You can sleep 8 hours and still wake up with it. It's the exhaustion of a mind that never stops, that processes everything, that analyzes, predicts, replays, prepares. That turns a simple decision into a 3-hour internal debate. That can't watch a movie without noticing the plot holes, can't have a conversation without mentally editing what it should have said, can't start a project without first imagining every possible way it could go wrong. You know what I'm talking about, that voice, the one that's always running, always commenting, always one step ahead, or 2 steps behind, or somewhere else entirely, but never just here. Psychologists have a term for this. They call it cognitive overload. But that sounds clinical, too clean. What it actually feels like from the inside is more like living in a house where every light is on, every television is playing a different channel, and you can't find the switch to turn any of it off. And here's what that constant mental noise does over time. It disconnects you from your instincts. Because instinct is quiet. Instinct doesn't argue or justify itself. It just knows. But when your mind is always loud, always producing reasons and counter reasons, always building cases for and against every possible move, that quiet signal gets buried. And you stop trusting it. You start trusting your analysis instead, your models, your frameworks. And those tools are useful, but they were never designed to replace the part of you that simply acts. There's a researcher named Ellen Langer who spent decades studying what she called mindless behavior. Not stupidity, the opposite actually. She found that highly intelligent people are often the most prone to what she called premature cognitive commitment. They form a mental model early and then they defend it. They stop seeing what's actually in front of them because they're too busy managing the idea of what's in front of them. In plain terms, the smarter you are, the easier it is to get trapped inside your own head. And this creates a painful irony. The same mind that can see farther than most, that can hold complexity, that can solve problems other people don't even know exist, that same mind becomes the primary obstacle between you and the life you're trying to build. Not because it's broken, but because it's running a program that was written for survival, not for growth. Think about what it means to be the smart kid. You learn early that being right matters, that having the answer matters, that appearing competent is how you earn your place. And failure, even small failure, even private failure that nobody else sees, feels like a direct threat to the identity you've spent your whole life constructing. So you protect that identity carefully, strategically. You don't start things you're not sure you can finish well. You don't commit publicly to goals you might not reach. You hedge, you qualify. You stay in the research phase just a little bit longer. Because as long as you're still planning, you're still the person with potential. And potential, unlike results, can never be proven wrong. That's not weakness. That's a protection strategy. One that made sense at some point. One that probably served you in some real way. But protection strategies have a shelf life. And when they outlive their usefulness, they don't quietly retire. They stay. They run in the background. They shape every decision without announcing themselves. And the longer they run, the more invisible they become, which is exactly what makes them so hard to dismantle. You can't fight something you can't see. You can't change a pattern you haven't named. And most people spend decades living inside these invisible structures, occasionally bumping into the walls, sensing that something is off, but never quite identifying what it is. That's what we're doing here, naming it, not to judge it, not to turn it into another reason to feel bad about yourself, but because clarity is the first real move. Because you cannot navigate a maze you refuse to look at directly. And the maze, it turns out, was built from something most people would never suspect. It was built from the very thing that was supposed to set you free. Let's talk about fear. But not the kind you're thinking of. Not the fear of spiders or heights or dark alleys. I'm talking about a quieter fear. One that doesn't announce itself. One that wears the clothes of logic and reason and careful thinking. One that you've probably mistaken for wisdom more times than you can count. The fear of being seen trying. There's something uniquely painful about being known as the smart one and then failing publicly. Because when an average person fails, it's expected. It's part of the story. Nobody updates their opinion dramatically, but when you fail, when the person who was supposed to figure it out doesn't figure it out, it feels like something much larger collapses. Not just the project, not just the goal, the entire identity, and your brain knows this. It has always known this. So it developed a solution. Don't fully commit. Stay 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Give yourself an exit ramp. That way, if it doesn't work, you can tell yourself and everyone else that you weren't really trying, that you could have done it if you'd actually gone all in, that this wasn't your real attempt. Psychologists call this self-handicapping, and it is one of the most well-documented patterns in high-potential individuals. It shows up as procrastination, as perfectionism, as the project that's always almost ready, as the business idea that needs just a little more research, as the relationship where you never quite let the wall down all the way, as the career move you've been considering for 4 years. All of it is the same thing. A very sophisticated way of never having to find out what you're actually capable of. Because as long as you don't fully try, the dream stays intact. The potential stays alive. You remain, in your own mind, the person who could have. And that word, could, is doing enormous damage. Could have, would have, might have. These are the words that keep you company at 2 a.m. These are the words that make your chest tight when you hear about someone from your past who built something real. These are the words that follow you into retirement, into old age, into the last chapters of a life that had so much more in it. But here's what I need you to understand. That fear is not a character flaw. It's not evidence that you're broken or weak or fundamentally different from people who seem to move through life with more ease. It's a response, a learned response to a specific set of experiences that taught you very early that your value was conditional. Conditional on being right, on being impressive, on not embarrassing yourself or the people who believed in you. That's a heavy thing to carry. And most people who carry it don't even realize it's there anymore. It's just the weight of normal. The background hum of a life lived slightly smaller than it could be. And the worst part is that intelligence makes it easier to sustain. Because every time you get close to something real, close to actually committing, close to the edge of the leap, your mind generates a perfectly reasonable argument for why this isn't the right moment, why you need more time, why the conditions aren't quite right yet. And you listen, because it sounds smart, because it sounds careful, because it sounds like exactly the kind of thinking that separates you from people who rush in without thinking. But there's a difference between strategic patience and indefinite delay dressed up as strategy. And deep down in the part of you that doesn't lie, you already know which one you've been living. The question is what you do with that knowledge. Because knowing is not enough. You've known for a long time. Knowing without moving is just a more sophisticated form of staying stuck. And this is where most conversations about potential end. With awareness, with insight, with the good feeling of having understood something. But understanding is not the destination. It's the beginning. And the beginning requires something that intelligence alone cannot provide. It requires a willingness to be uncomfortable, to be uncertain, to act before you feel ready, before the plan is perfect, before the fear goes away. Because here's the truth that took me a long time to accept. The fear doesn't go away first. The move comes first. The fear, if it fades at all, fades afterward. in the doing, in the showing up imperfectly and continuing anyway. You've been waiting for the fear to leave before you start. But that's not how it works. That's never been how it works. And some part of you has always known that too. There's a man I want to tell you about. He was, by every external measure, exceptional. Graduated near the top of his class. Sharp, articulate, the kind of person who could walk into any room and immediately understand what was happening. People liked him, respected him, expected things from him. By his mid-40s, he had a decent job, a comfortable life, and a growing sense that he had somehow missed the point of everything. He wasn't depressed exactly, he functioned. He showed up. He did what needed to be done. But there was this persistent feeling, like a song playing in another room, that he could almost make out but never quite hear clearly. Something unfinished. Something he kept circling, but never landing on. He told me once that the hardest part wasn't the regret. It was the confusion. Because he had done everything right. He had been careful, thoughtful, responsible. He had avoided the obvious mistakes. And yet, here he was, in the middle of his life, feeling like a stranger to himself. I've heard versions of that story more times than I can count. Different names, different details, same feeling at the center of it. And what strikes me every time is this. These are not people who failed to think enough. They thought constantly, deeply, about everything. That was never the problem. The problem was that thinking had become a substitute for living. There's a concept in psychology called experiential avoidance. It's the tendency to avoid internal experiences, thoughts, feelings, memories, physical sensations that feel uncomfortable or threatening. And what the research shows consistently is that the more you try to avoid an uncomfortable internal experience, the more power it gains over your behavior. In other words, the thing you're running from ends up steering the car. For smart people, this avoidance is rarely obvious. It doesn't look like hiding under the covers or refusing to leave the house. It looks like productivity, like research, like staying busy with things that feel meaningful but conveniently keep you away from the one thing that actually scares you. You reorganize your workspace instead of making the call. You read another book on the subject. Instead of starting the project, you have another conversation about your goals instead of sitting down and doing the uncomfortable, unglamorous, uncertain work of pursuing them. And the mind cooperates fully. Because the mind is very good at generating justifications, at finding reasons why what you're doing right now is actually necessary, why the timing still isn't right, why one more preparation step stands between you and the real work. This is not stupidity. This is the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, protect you from perceived threat. The problem is that it can't distinguish between a tiger and a blank page, between physical danger and the vulnerability of trying something that matters. To your nervous system, both feel the same. And so, it responds the same way. Avoid, delay, find something safer to do, and here's what that costs over a lifetime. Not just the projects that never launched, not just the ideas that stayed ideas. It costs you your relationship with yourself, your trust in your own word. Because every time you tell yourself you're going to do something and then find a reason not to, you're making a small withdrawal from an account that can only hold so much. After enough withdrawals, you stop believing yourself. And when you stop believing yourself, starting anything feels pointless. Because somewhere underneath the planning and the research and the careful preparation, there's a voice that's learned to ask the same quiet question every time. Why bother? You won't follow through anyway. That voice is not the truth, but it feels like the truth. And by the time most people hear it clearly enough to recognize what it is, it's been running the show for years. But here's what I've learned about that voice. It's not your enemy. It was never trying to destroy you. It was trying to protect the last thing it had left to protect, your sense of self. Because if you never truly try, you never truly fail. And if you never truly fail, some version of the dream survives. The tragedy is that the dream survives, but you don't, not fully. You go through the motions. You maintain the appearance of a life, but the real you, the one with something to say, something to build, something to leave behind, that version keeps getting postponed. And postponed lives don't announce their endings. They just quietly run out of time. I want to talk about identity, because everything we've covered so far, the fear, the avoidance, the self-handicapping, it all connects back to one thing: the story you believe about who you are. Not the story you tell other people, the one you tell yourself. In the morning, before the day starts. In the quiet moments when nobody's watching. The story that runs underneath everything else, shaping what you attempt, what you avoid, what you believe is possible for someone like you. Most people have never examined that story. They inherited it from childhood, from early experiences, from the accumulated evidence of a life lived in a particular way. And because it's been there so long, it doesn't feel like a story. It feels like reality. Here's what I mean. If you grew up as the smart one, chances are your identity got built around capability, around being the person who figures things out. And that identity feels solid until you encounter something you can't figure out, something that resists your intelligence, something that requires not cleverness, but courage, not analysis, but action, not knowing, but doing. And in that moment, something uncomfortable happens. The identity doesn't fit, and rather than update the identity, most people retreat from the challenge. Because the challenge isn't just a challenge anymore. It's a threat to the entire structure of who they believe themselves to be. Psychologists call this identity protective cognition. The mind works harder to protect a belief about itself than it does to find the truth. And the stronger the identity, the more aggressively it defends itself against information that contradicts it. This is why smart people can hold on to self-defeating patterns for decades, while simultaneously understanding exactly why those patterns are self-defeating. The understanding lives in one part of the mind. The identity lives somewhere older, somewhere deeper, somewhere that doesn't respond to logic. You can read every book on procrastination and still procrastinate. You can understand self-sabotage intellectually and still sabotage yourself, because the behavior isn't coming from the part of you that reads books. It's coming from the part that decided a long time ago what kind of person you are and what kind of person you're allowed to become. And that part doesn't update through information. It updates through experience. I want to talk about identity, because everything we've covered so far, the fear, the avoidance, the self-handicapping, it all connects back to one thing: the story you believe about who you are. Not the story you tell other people, the one you tell yourself. In the morning, before the day starts. In the quiet moments when nobody's watching. The story that runs underneath everything else, shaping what you attempt, what you avoid, what you believe is possible for someone like you. Most people have never examined that story. They inherited it from childhood, from early experiences, from the accumulated evidence of a life lived in a particular way. And because it's been there so long, it doesn't feel like a story. It feels like reality. Here's what I mean. If you grew up as the smart one, chances are your identity got built around capability, around being the person who figures things out. And that identity feels solid until you encounter something you can't figure out, something that resists your intelligence, something that requires not cleverness, but courage, not analysis, but action, not knowing, but doing. And in that moment, something uncomfortable happens. The identity doesn't fit, and rather than update the identity, most people retreat from the challenge. Because the challenge isn't just a challenge anymore. It's a threat to the entire structure of who they believe themselves to be. Psychologists call this identity protective cognition. The mind works harder to protect a belief about itself than it does to find the truth. And the stronger the identity, the more aggressively it defends itself against information that contradicts it. This is why smart people can hold on to self-defeating patterns for decades, while simultaneously understanding exactly why those patterns are self-defeating. The understanding lives in one part of the mind. The identity lives somewhere older, somewhere deeper, somewhere that doesn't respond to logic. You can read every book on procrastination and still procrastinate. You can understand self-sabotage intellectually and still sabotage yourself, because the behavior isn't coming from the part of you that reads books. It's coming from the part that decided a long time ago what kind of person you are and what kind of person you're allowed to become. And that part doesn't update through information. It updates through experience, through repeated action that contradicts the old story, through showing up in ways that don't match the script. That's the uncomfortable truth about change at this level. It's not a mental shift. It's a behavioral one. You don't think your way into a new identity. You act your way into it. Imperfectly, inconsistently, with plenty of backsliding and doubt, and moments where the old story rushes back in with a full argument for why you were right to stay small. But here's what starts to happen when you move anyway. When you do the thing, despite the fear, despite the voice, despite every reasonable justification for waiting, something small shifts. Not dramatically, not in a way that makes a good. There's something nobody tells you about wasted potential. The real cost isn't external. It's not the career you didn't build, or the money you didn't make, or the recognition you never received. Those things matter, but they're not what keeps you up at night. What keeps you up at night is the relationship you have with yourself. Because every year that passes with the gap still open between who you are and who you know you could be, that gap doesn't just stay the same size. It grows. Not necessarily in reality, but in weight, in the meaning you attach to it, in the way it starts to feel less like a temporary situation and more like a permanent verdict. And somewhere along the way, without making a conscious decision about it, many people shift from, I haven't done it yet, to, I'm the kind of person who doesn't do things. From a temporary state to a fixed identity. From a situation to a sentence. That shift is quiet. It doesn't arrive with an announcement. It seeps in through accumulated evidence, through enough mornings of good intentions that dissolved by afternoon, through enough January 1st that looked just like December 31st, through enough versions of the same conversation with yourself that ended the same way. And once that shift happens, once you start seeing yourself as fundamentally someone who doesn't follow through, the behavior changes to match the belief. Not because you're weak, because that's how identity works. We act in accordance with who we believe we are. We find evidence that confirms the story. We unconsciously arrange our lives around the narrative. This is what the research on learned helplessness actually looks like in real life. It's not dramatic. It's not someone curled up and refusing to engage with the world. It's a person who still tries, still starts, still makes plans, but with a ceiling built in. A quiet assumption underneath everything that this probably won't work either. And the devastating irony is that assumption often becomes self-fulfilling. Not because the person is incapable, but because you cannot build something lasting on a foundation of half-belief. Half-belief looks like starting and stopping, like doing just enough to feel like you're moving, without ever fully committing, like keeping one eye on the exit, because some part of you is already expecting to need it. I want to be direct with you here, because I think you've heard enough gentle framing. If you are in your 40s or 50s and you are still carrying the same unrealized potential you were carrying in your 30s, something has to change. Not your circumstances, not your schedule, not your resources. Something in the way you are relating to yourself and to the life in front of you. Because the window is not closing, but it is not infinite either. And I don't say that to frighten you. I say it because I think you already feel it. That's why you're here. That's why this video landed the way it did. That's why you're still watching. You feel the urgency. You felt it for a while. An urgency, real urgency, not anxiety, not panic, but the clear-eyed recognition that time is a resource and you've been spending it carelessly. That urgency is not your enemy. It's information. It's the part of you that still believes something is possible, pushing against the part of you that has learned to doubt. listen to the first part, because here's what I've seen happen. Not in theory, not in research studies, but in actual human lives. People who seemed completely stuck, who had every reason to believe their best years were behind them, who had built elaborate mental architectures justifying their smallness, those people changed. Not because their circumstances changed first, because they made a decision that their circumstances were no longer an acceptable explanation. They stopped negotiating with the fear. They stopped waiting for confidence. They stopped asking their old identity for permission to become something new. And they started, imperfectly, quietly, without fanfare or announcement. They just started. That's available to you, right now. Not after you figure out the plan. Not after you feel ready. Not after this video ends and you've had time to think about it. Now. And I know how that sounds. I know the part of your brain that's already composing a response to that, already listing the reasons why your situation is more complicated than I'm making it seem, already building the case for why now isn't quite right. I'm not asking you to ignore that voice. I'm asking you to move anyway, to take one real step, not a planning step, not a thinking step, a doing step, while the voice is still talking, because that's the only way it loses its grip, not by being silenced, by being disobeyed. If you've made it this far into this video with me, I want to stop for just a moment and say something directly. This channel exists for exactly this kind of conversation, the ones that don't fit in a tweet, the ones that take time to unfold. If what you've heard today has felt like something you needed to hear, subscribe, hit the bell. Because we go deeper here every single week, and I don't want you to miss what's coming next. And if this hit close to home, drop a comment. Tell me the one thing you keep trying to build but keep walking away from. Not because I'm collecting data, because naming it out loud, even in a comment section, is a different kind of commitment than keeping it inside your head. And I'm building future videos around exactly those struggles, with your words, your patterns, your real experience at the center of it. Now, back to what matters. Because here's what we haven't talked about yet, and it might be the most important piece of everything. You've spent this entire video understanding why you've been stuck. The identity protection, the self-handicapping, the fear wearing the mask of wisdom, the gap between knowing and doing. All of it real, all of it valid. But understanding why you're stuck and actually getting unstuck are two completely different problems. And most people stop at the understanding. They walk away from a video like this feeling seen, feeling like something shifted, and then wake up the next morning and do exactly what they've always done. Not because they're weak, because insight without a structural change in behavior is just a more articulate version of the same stuck place. So let me tell you what actually moves the needle. Not motivation, not another framework, not a morning routine or a productivity system or a better set of goals. What moves the needle is learning to tolerate the discomfort of being in motion before you feel ready. That's it. That's the whole thing. Stated plainly, it sounds almost too simple. But living it is one of the hardest things a human being can do. Because everything in your wiring, everything in your history, everything in the identity you've spent decades constructing is pulling in the opposite direction. Towards safety, towards certainty, toward one more day of preparation before the real thing begins. And the only way through that pull is not to fight it. Fighting it gives it energy. The way through is to acknowledge it fully, to say, yes, I feel this. I see what my mind is doing, and then move anyway. Small, specific, concrete. Not a life overhaul, not a dramatic reinvention. One thing. Today, that your future self will recognize as the moment something actually changed. Because that's how it starts for everyone who eventually gets there. Not with a revelation, not with a perfect plan, with one quiet decision made in an ordinary moment that nobody else sees or applauds, to stop waiting and begin. And here's what that beginning actually looks like in practice. Because I think we owe it to each other to be specific. It doesn't look like waking up transformed. It doesn't look like suddenly having clarity or confidence or an unshakable sense of direction. It looks like doing the thing while still feeling uncertain, while still hearing the voice that says, "This is pointless. You've tried this before. Nothing is going to be different this time." It looks like writing the first paragraph of something you've been meaning to write for 3 years, even if it's bad. Making the call you've been avoiding for 6 months, even if the conversation is awkward. Saying yes to the thing that scares you before your brain has time to construct a case against it. These moments don't feel significant when they happen. That's the part nobody tells you. Real change rarely announces itself. It's quiet, almost anticlimactic. You do the thing, and then life continues, and nothing explodes, and nothing transforms overnight. But something small shifts. Something in the record your brain keeps of who you are. And that shift, as small as it is the beginning of a different kind of evidence. Evidence that you are, in fact, someone who moves. Someone who acts despite the fear. Someone who can be trusted by themselves. And that trust, once it starts to rebuild, changes everything. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily in the way that real things grow.